So imagine a scenario that is, probably playing out in thousands of homes right now. There's a teacher, and she's sitting at her kitchen table grading this massive stack of papers late into the evening.
Right, a classic scene.
Yeah. And she rubs her wrist. It's aching again. And initially, it was just the one wrist, maybe after a long week of writing on the whiteboard. But lately, she's noticed it has kind of spread.
Like it's moving.
Exactly. Now it's both wrists. And she's even starting to feel this deep, just this persistent ache in a few of her finger knuckles, too. But, she sighs, grabs her pen, and just tells herself, well, it's just work. I'm just getting older.
Oh, man. I mean, it is such an incredibly common reaction. We naturally look for the simplest explanation for our pain, right?
Yeah, totally.
But the clinical research we're diving into today really highlights how much quiet damage that word just can do. Because when we look at the specific behavior of her pain, it's actually telling a much more complex story.
Right, because the details in her story, they're actually flashing red warning lights.
Yeah.
The pain isn't random. It's behaving in a very specific way.
Exactly. What we're seeing here is a symmetrical symptom pattern. The pain is happening on both sides of her body simultaneously, so both wrists, the knuckles on both hands.
Right.
And crucially, it is spreading rather than resolving. In rheumatology, we call this an additive pattern.
Additive pattern, okay.
Yeah. The inflammation doesn't just, jump from joint to joint, packing up its bags and leaving the previous location. It sets up camp, establishes a foothold, and then it actively recruits new joints to the problem.
Wow.
It is the first major clue that we are not dealing with simple mechanical wear and tear.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
We are looking at rheumatoid arthritis, but we're going way beyond just the surface level symptoms.
Absolutely.
Like in some of the other materials we've explored, we looked at the structural side of the disease, the physical buildup of that invasive tissue called the pannus.
The pannus, right.
But today, our goal is to look past the structural damage. We want to investigate the actual microscopic cellular war that's happening inside a chronically inflamed rheumatoid joint.
It's fascinating.
It really is. We want to know what exactly goes wrong to make the human body turn on itself with such, aggressive and relentless precision.
Right. And to understand that war, we first have to identify the soldiers and the battlefield.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So the battlefield is the synovium, which is that delicate, super slippery membrane that lines the inside of your joints and helps them glide smoothly. But the soldiers, they have entirely abandoned their normal posts.
Right. And to visualize this for everyone listening, imagine a courtroom.
I love this analogy.
It works so well, right? Normally, a courtroom is this place of highly regulated structure. You have rules of procedure, you have a judge keeping order, and you have people speaking only when they're spoken to.
Very orderly.
Exactly. Now, imagine a courtroom that has completely, utterly lost its structure. Like everyone is shouting at the exact same time, the doors have been locked from the inside, and the judge has been physically thrown out the window.
Just total chaos.
Yeah, that absolute self-sustaining chaos is the literal cellular reality inside a chronically inflamed rheumatoid joint.
That courtroom analogy tracks perfectly with the synovial environment in RA. Because if we look at who is doing the initial shouting in this rogue courtroom, the research points to a group of cells referred to as the resident troublemakers.
The resident troublemakers, who are they?
These are the synovial fibroblast-like synoviocytes and the macrophage-like synovial cells.
And I think the key word there is right, because these are cells that are fundamentally supposed to be the peaceful residents and housekeepers of the joint.
Exactly.
Like macrophages usually clean up cellular debris and fibroblasts help maintain the tissue structure. They're the good guys.
Normally, yes, they completely keep the peace. But in this rogue state, they become the primary instigators. They start overproducing pro-inflammatory cytokines right there in the local tissue.
And cytokines are basically chemical messenger proteins, right? So in our courtroom, these are the megaphones.
That's a great way to put it. Yes, they are the megaphones.
So they aren't just talking, they are broadcasting distress signals at absolute maximum volume.
Exactly. The macrophages use specific docking stations on their outer surface. They're called FCC receptors. And they use these to trigger the mass production of a whole arsenal of chemical weapons. Yeah, they start flooding the joint space with these heavy-hitting inflammatory signals, specifically interleukin-1, interleukin-8, and a really major one called TNF-alpha.
But the research emphasizes that this isn't just, a random spilling of chemicals. It is a highly coordinated chain reaction.
Oh, absolutely.
Because alongside those interleukins and TNF-alpha, these macrophages release a specific colony-stimulating factor. And this factor has one very specific job. It literally walks right over to the fibroblasts and activates them.
Yep, it turns them on.
Right. It forces them to start pumping out even more of another chemical called interleukin-6, or IL-6.
Which creates this totally devastating local amplification loop. The macrophages yell, which hands a megaphone to the fibroblasts, who then start yelling even louder.
Wow. So they're reinforcing each other's panic.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And because it's happening in an enclosed space, the joint cavity, the concentration of these inflammatory chemicals just keeps rising and rising.
Okay, so we established the chaos. But you have to wonder, how does this shouting match sustain itself?
That's the big question.
Right, because usually a fire burns out when it runs out of fuel. A riot eventually disperses when people get tired. How do we move from this initial chemical spark to a self-sustaining feedback loop that can last for literally decades?
Well, to answer that, we have to introduce a new character to our chaotic courtroom. Synovial B cells.
Okay, B cells.
Yeah. Normally, B cells are a super vital, highly mobile part of your adaptive immune system. They're the factories that produce antibodies to fight off foreign invaders, like viruses or bacteria.
Right, they're the defense contractors.
Exactly. But in rheumatoid arthritis, these B cells arrive at the joint, they get activated by all the shouting, and they essentially become on-site weapon manufacturers for the wrong side.
Wait, so they start producing autoantibodies,
Yeah.
antibodies that are specifically programmed to target the body's own tissue.
Precisely. In classic RA, they mostly produce an autoantibody of the IgM class.
Yeah.
But what this IgM antibody targets is what makes this disease so incredibly destructive.
What does it target?
It targets the Fc portion, which is essentially the tail end of your body's own normal, healthy IgG antibodies.
Okay, wait, let's break that down because that sounds like friendly fire on a massive scale.
It really is.
So these rogue IgM antibodies act like misguided homing missiles. But instead of targeting, like, a piece of a flu virus, they are specifically designed to lock onto your body's normal defense system. They drag healthy antibodies directly into the crossfire.
That's exactly how it works.
Yeah.
And because they're locking onto other antibodies, they create a distinct physical problem.
Which is?
Well, these specific autoantibodies have a highly destructive property. They self-aggregate, they stick together.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they form these dense, heavy clusters called immune complexes right there in the synovial tissue. They don't float away in the bloodstream to be cleared out by the liver or the spleen.
Yeah.
They just build up in the very tissue they're being manufactured in.
And when those heavy clumps of immune complexes build up, they bump into the initial troublemakers we talked about earlier, right?
Exactly.
They physically lock into those Fc receptor docking stations on the macrophages, which triggers the macrophages to release more cytokines, which activate the fibroblasts, which keeps the environment inflamed, which keeps the B cells active, which produces more immune complexes.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a completely closed, self-sustaining loop.
It is entirely self-perpetuating. But amazingly, the biology goes even deeper than that.
How so?
Well, the synovial fibroblasts, those localized joint cells we just talked about, they don't just shout chemical signals. The papers in our stack show that they actually start building physical fortifications to protect this rogue system.
Wait, I want to challenge this on behalf of everyone listening, because this is wild. If the joint lining, the synovium, is literally building fortifications and acting like a rogue organ, why don't surgeons just go in and scrape the lining out entirely?
It's a really logical question.
Right. Why rely on this complex chemical warfare if we can just physically remove the troublemakers?
Well, in fact, surgical synovectomy, where they remove the inflamed lining, is a procedure that exists.
So it does.
It does, but it's generally considered a temporary fix or, a last resort for very specific mechanical issues. The problem is that while you can scrape out the local tissue, the systemic signals, the rogue immune memory, and the underlying chemical imbalances remain in the body.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so within months or years, the microscopic cells just recolonize the joint and rebuild the exact same fortifications all over again.
It's because you didn't turn off the factories, you just demolished one of their warehouses.
Exactly. And the way they build these warehouses is remarkably robust. To prevent the body from naturally clearing out this localized reaction, the synovial fibroblasts start expressing high levels of a specific adhesion molecule.
Okay.
And this molecule acts like physical scaffolding. It grabs onto the B lymphocytes and physically supports their survival.
So they're literally holding the weapon manufacturers in place and building a shelter for them.
Yes. Furthermore, The fibroblasts produce a factor that actively blocks something called complement-mediated cell death.
Wait, the complement system? That's part of your immune system's natural cleanup crew, right?
Right. It's this elegant biological sequence designed to induce cell death in problematic, infected, or rogue cells. But the fibroblasts secrete a local shield that effectively makes these rogue B cells and macrophages immune to the body's own self-destruct signals.
Wow. Which means the joint is doing something just extraordinary. The synovium, this thin, slippery lining of that teacher's wrist, essentially builds its own miniature, fully functional immune organ in a place it fundamentally does not belong.
It really does.
It creates scaffolding, it secures a local supply line, it shields itself from the cleanup crew, and it self-generates the signals to keep firing. I mean, that is why rheumatoid arthritis becomes a chronic, lifelong condition rather than just a swollen wrist that gets better after a few weeks of rest.
Exactly. You aren't just fighting abstract inflammation. You're fighting a rogue organ that has completely colonized the joint space.
But surely the body has an internal police force. If a rogue organ is being built in my wrist, where is the biological SWAT team? Why doesn't the broader immune system recognize this courtroom has gone completely mad and shut the whole thing down?
That is where the tragedy of this whole cellular cascade lies. The brakes are completely broken.
The brakes.
Remember that judge you mentioned earlier who got thrown out the window? Biologically, those are your regulatory T cells. Their entire job is to recognize when an immune response is getting out of hand and actively suppress it. They enforce the peace.
But they failed to do that here. Why?
Because the chemical environment just jams their signals. In RA, the growth factor and interleukin signals pouring out of those macrophages disrupt the regulatory T cells. But honestly, it starts even earlier than that with a process called antigen presentation.
Antigen presentation. Okay, how does that work?
Think of it like a molecular breathing room. Specialized cells, called dendritic cells, are supposed to present wanted posters to the T cells, showing them exactly what foreign invader to attack.
Right.
But in RA, the dendritic cells present the wrong wanted posters. They present pieces of the body's own tissue. And because the regulatory T cells are suppressed by all the chemical chaos, they can't object.
And while nature abhors a vacuum, because the brakes are broken and the judge is gone, another type of T cell steps in to take over the briefing room.
Exactly. A specific inflammatory subset of T cells called Th17 helper cells. Yeah. Without the regulatory T cells to keep them in check, this Th17 population just expands rapidly. And these cells exist to incite even more activity.
Of course they do.
They produce a whole cocktail of specialized interleukins, specifically IL-17, 21, and 22. And these serve as advanced distress signals that do nothing but incite further inflammation, attract more rogue cells, and pump out even more TNF-alpha.
It's like throwing gasoline on a fire that's already burning inside a powder keg.
It really is.
But I want to pivot here because all these chemical signals, the IL-6, the Th17, the B cells, it is deeply fascinating microscopic chaos.
Yeah.
But to you listening, how does this invisible cellular shouting match actually lead to the very visible physical bone deformities we see in advanced RA patients? You know, the twisted knuckles, the eroding joints.
That is the ultimate consequence of this entire cascade, and it comes down to a final, truly devastating player, the osteoclast.
Okay.
All of these pathways we've discussed, the macrophages, the B cells, the T cells, the fibroblasts, all of their chemical shouting eventually converges on a single molecular switch. It's called ARO-NKL.
NKL. So that's RANKL.
Yes, RNKL. It is the specific trigger that activates osteoclasts. And osteoclasts are specialized cells whose sole biological purpose is to resorb or essentially chew up bone tissue.
Oh, wow.
Now, in a healthy person, osteoclasts work in perfect harmony with bone-building cells to constantly remodel and refresh your skeleton. It's like a balanced construction site.
But when bathed in this massive overproduction of RAN-NK from the rogue immune organ...
The balance is destroyed. The osteoclasts just go into overdrive. They become the bone chewers. They're the ones quietly eating through the actual structural walls of our proverbial courtroom, causing irreversible bone erosion right alongside the cartilage damage being done by the inflammatory tissue.
Now, one of the papers in our stack highlights a stunning connection here that we definitely have to talk about. This exact molecule, RANKL, is the precise molecular switch that is targeted by osteoporosis drugs.
Yes, it's incredible.
Right. Osteoporosis is a disease where bones naturally become brittle and porous over time, typically as a result of aging or hormonal changes, completely separate from an autoimmune attack. And yet, this one molecule bridges two completely different clinical worlds.
It is a remarkable piece of biology. It shows us that while the origins of diseases can be vastly different, a localized autoimmune rogue organ on one hand versus systemic metabolic bone loss on the other, the ultimate executioners often use the exact same molecular tools to tear down the bone.
So having mapped this truly horrifying chain of events, from the shouting macrophages to the scaffolding fibroblasts to the bone-chewing osteoclasts, we now understand the battlefield. But how does modern medicine actually fight back? Because mapping this pathway isn't just an academic exercise, right?
Far from it. In fact, mapping this exact cellular cascade has provided the literal blueprint for modern rheumatology.
Wow.
Yeah, for decades, the only real option was to throw heavy general immunosuppressants at the problem like high-dose steroids. And that was essentially throwing a blanket of thick fog over the entire immune system and just hoping it smothered the fire in the joint. But it caused massive collateral damage to the rest of the body.
Because it left the patient vulnerable to everything else.
Exactly. But today, the approach is entirely different. It's targeted. Every major class of modern RA drug maps onto exactly one specific step of the chain we've just described.
So we are using sniper rifles instead of scatterguns.
Exactly. Let's start with TNF-alpha blockers. Based on the cascade we outlined, these biologics go right after the primary megaphones used by those macrophages and Th17 cells.
So instead of shutting down the cell, these drugs just act like massive molecular sponges, right? Circulating through the joint and soaking up the TNF-alpha before it can reach its target. You pull that specific inflammatory signal right out of the loop.
Precisely. But what happens if a patient's particular rogue organ relies more heavily on a different communication line?
Okay.
That is where IL-6 pathway blockers come in. Remember the fibroblasts pumping out IL-6 to keep the loop going? These drugs specifically interrupt that cytokine's ability to bind to its receptors.
Okay, but what about the T cells in the briefing room? The ones that lost their judge and started inciting the riot through bad antigen presentation.
For those, rheumatologists can use T-cell co-stimulation blockers.
Co-stimulation block.
Yeah, they essentially act as a molecular gag. For a T cell to get fully activated by an antigen-presenting cell, it requires a secondary handshake signal.
A handshake.
Right. And these drugs block that handshake. They interrupt the specific activation step that allows T cells to get fired up in the first place, stopping them from ever joining the cascade.
Wow. And for the weapon manufacturers themselves, the B cells building those immune complexes.
We use B-cell depleting therapies. These are biologic drugs that seek out a specific marker on the surface of B cells and directly remove them from the environment. Yeah. It is the equivalent of basically evicting the rogue weapon manufacturers from the courtroom. No B cells means no new autoantibodies, which means no new immune complexes forming and clumping in the joint to trigger the macrophages.
So you're taking out the factories entirely.
Exactly.
And finally, there are JA inhibitors, which the research spends a lot of time on. These seem, well, fundamentally different from the others. Like, they aren't floating around the joint fluid sponging up cytokines or evicting specific cells.
That's right. They operate on a completely different level. JK inhibitors work inside the cells.
Inside the cells.
Yeah. Many of the cytokines we talked about, like IL-6 or the various interleukins from the Th17 cells, they have to attach to the outside of a cell's surface and then send a signal deep into the cell's nucleus to actually cause an effect. They use the JK signaling pathway, which is like a series of internal molecular wires, to do that.
So a JK inhibitor essentially sneaks into the cell and cuts the internal phone lines. Even if the cytokines are outside the cell shouting into the megaphones, the cell's nucleus simply can't hear them.
Exactly. And what is so brilliant about this is that understanding this cellular cascade transforms what is usually just, a confusing random list of unpronounceable medications into a deeply logical, precision-engineered battle plan.
Totally.
You can see exactly why a doctor might try blocking TNF first. And if the joint finds a workaround and the symptoms return, they don't just guess blindly. They shift their strategy based on the biology. They might switch to cutting the internal phone lines with a JAK inhibitor or evicting the factories with B-cell depletion.
It's strategic warfare based entirely on understanding the architecture of the rogue organ.
It really is.
But as we move to wrap this up, the clinical papers issue a very stark warning about how we treat and manage this disease.
They do, and it is a critical pitfall. Controlling the visible symptoms, like our teacher noticing her wrist pain has finally faded after starting a biologic drug, that does not automatically mean the underlying cellular process has fully stopped.
Because the pain she feels is just the loudest part of the alarm system.
Exactly. Some of these cytokine loops, particularly those operating deeper in the synovial tissue, can persist subclinically.
Subclinically.
Yeah. The raging fire might be reduced to smoldering embers, but the embers are still hot. They can still be slowly generating enough ARNKL to cause slow, microscopic damage to the bone and cartilage over time, even if the patient feels relatively fine.
Which is why the research emphasizes that rigorous, ongoing disease monitoring is absolutely critical. A doctor can't just ask, does your wrist still hurt?
Right.
They have to use blood markers to check for systemic inflammation, imaging like ultrasounds or MRIs to look for active fluid in the joint, and do regular clinical joint counts. Because if you assume no pain means the rogue courtroom has been completely dismantled, you might be allowing silent joint destruction to just continue.
You have to confirm that the cellular war has actually ended, not just that the volume of the shouting has been turned down.
That is such an important distinction. So to ensure you walk away with the complete blueprint of this cascade, let's lock it in with a quick summary of the exact sequence.
Let's do it.
Okay, it starts with antigen presentation, the dendritic cells handing out the wrong wanted posters. Because the regulatory T cell brakes are broken, this triggers the activation of Th17 cells, which incite the riot. Those T cells encourage B cells to arrive and produce autoantibodies.
All right.
Then those antibodies clump together into immune complexes, which dock into the macrophages, causing a massive release of cytokines like TNF and IL-6 that creates the fortified self-sustaining loop. And finally, that entire chemical storm flips the switch on RNKL, which drives the osteoclast to start chewing up the bone.
It is a profoundly complex cascade, but when you break it down step by step like that, the grim mechanistic logic of it all just becomes incredibly clear.
It really does. And as we finish up this deep dive into the research, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We have just seen how one unchecked feedback loop allows the body to accidentally build a highly structured, self-sustaining rogue immune organ right inside a single joint, complete with its own scaffolding and defense mechanisms.
It's wild.
It forces you to wonder, what other chronic, stubborn conditions out there in the world of medicine conditions that we casually dismiss right now as simple wear and tear or just getting older might actually be miniature rogue organs hiding in plain sight, quietly building their own fortifications against the rest of the human body?
That's a powerful thought.
It really makes you completely rethink the word just.